Hello and welcome back to another episode of Study Sessions, the English Literature Revision podcast from St. George's. My name, of course, is Mr. Boff, and in today's episode, we're focusing on A Christmas Carol and the theme of joy and happiness. And we're in fact using the Fezziwig party scene, one of my favourite scenes in the entire novella. We're focusing on that particular scene from Stave 2 as our starting point because that is the given extract. And our question is, starting with this extract, so the Fezziwig party scene, explore how Dickens presents the theme of joy and happiness in the book. So the purpose of today's episode is to help you see how Dickens presents joy and happiness as something moral and communal. It's not about wealth or possessions. It's about human connection. It's about family. It's about generosity. And it's about warmth, emotional warmth, to be precise. Now, to give you a bit of an overview of the extract, remember here, Scrooge is revisiting his past with the ghost of Christmas past in Stave 2, and he sees his old employer, Mr. Fezziwig, preparing for a Christmas party. And it is a moment in the book that is overflowing with life, with music and laughter and celebration. And it stands in complete stark contrast to the cold, lonely, bleak, depressing offices that Scrooge is inhabiting, Scrooge's counting house, and of course just how Scrooge is himself. Think about the melancholy Scrooge having his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. Not much of a laugh, okay? Unlike Fezziwig, Scrooge knows what it's like to have a boss who's full of life and joy and generosity. And it's important to remember that Dickens uses this joyful flashback to remind Scrooge, yes, but also by extension the reader, what true happiness looks like. It's not about the individual acquisition of wealth. It's about family, togetherness, human connection, okay? And it also is a reminder of how far Scrooge, and maybe, if we think about our own lives, ourselves as readers, how we can lose sight of that aspect of happiness, that aspect of joy, that actually true joy and happiness is not about you as an individual, it's about our relationship with other human beings. So, we're going to be starting with two quotations in today's episode taken from the extract, and this is really replicating the structure of our essays more generally. When we get given the extract, it's a good habit after we've written our thesis introduction to then delve into some really solid language analysis within the extracts before we move across to the beginning, the middle, and the end of the novella more generally. So let's go with the first quotation, which is, "He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself." Now, right away, Dickens brings Fezziwig to life through movement and that emotional warmth. Look at that series of verbs: rubbed, adjusted, laughed. These verbs, remember this is all Dickens making these particular choices, these word level choices. These are verbs that make joy feel active. It makes joy visible to us as readers. And that wonderful phrase, laughed all over himself, is particularly striking. Fezziwig's laughter isn't limited to just his mouth or his voice. It seems to fill his entire body, his whole body. Dickens then turns happiness into something almost contagious. It seems to radiate out from Fezziwig. And then we've got that wonderful adjective, capacious. It's a word that's linked to the word capacity. It shares the same etymology. And capacious means large or roomy. And it contributes to this broader sense of abundance that Dickens is really keen to associate Fezziwig with even. Fezziwig seems full of life. This is kind of abundance of life, abundance of generosity and good cheer. There's nothing tight or squeezing or wrenching or covetous or mean about Fezziwig at all. And so at a deeper level then, at the conceptual level, we might say, Dickens is using Fezziwig as a really clear symbol of the joy and happiness that comes from kindness and community. Fezziwig is a man, a boss, crucially, who gives freely his time, his energy, and his goodwill. And this is exactly the kind of moral generosity Dickens wants his readers, and indeed Scrooge, to value. So it's through that joyful, happy energy conveyed by Fezziwig that Dickens puts forward his core message, really, around joy and happiness, which is this: real happiness isn't bought, it's not to be found in your ledger, it's not to be found in profit or your like logbook of profit making. It's something that takes place, something that comes into existence when we have these shared moments of human connection. Okay, quotation 2. Okay, another wonderful quotation. In came a fiddler with a music book. In came Mrs. Fezziwig. In came the three Miss Fezziwigs. Now, this is a part of the extract that absolutely bursts with rhythm. That repetition of in came creates almost like a musical pulse, like the beat of a dance. It's a list that just keeps on expanding. It's a kind of capacious list, you might say, to quote that word from the previous quotation, just as joy itself expands when people gather together. In this case, gather together at Christmas. But we're not going to stop there, because Dickens's use of this repetition in came is really clever. The structure of the sentence mirrors the very spirit of the event. The party just keeps on growing. It's like a kind of the cornucopia or plenty's horn of parties. Okay, the happiness keeps multiplying. But there's also a social message here. Of course there is. Dickens has a whole series of social messages he wishes to articulate in this book. And remember, Dickens wrote at a time of enormous income inequality, a huge disparity between rich and poor in Victorian Britain, Victorian London, when, of course, many working people lived absolutely mired in poverty. So, by filling this scene with laughter and togetherness, he is reminding readers that joy is not the property of the rich, it belongs to everyone. So, Fezziwig's party, this extract scene, shows that moral wealth, okay, what we might call generosity, warmth, human connection, matters far more than financial wealth. That joy and happiness give us, in effect, a sort of moral wealth. When we are generous, when we are warm towards other people, when we celebrate and cherish human connection, that we benefit, that joy and happiness give us this kind of moral wealth, and that's far more valuable than any kind of financial wealth. We're going to move now from the extract to the rest of the novella, as indeed we must in the real exam. We need to show we understand the novella as a whole and not just remain rooted to the extract. And so, to begin with, we're going to begin at the beginning, makes sense. But we're going to start with the absence of joy and happiness, because to understand Dickens's message fully, we as readers need to be thinking about what it is that joy replaces. Remember, in the beginning, Scrooge has none, no joy, no happiness. Now, famously in Stave 1, when Scrooge's nephew Fred wishes him a Merry Christmas, Scrooge snaps back, "What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer?" It is a grim and bitter list. It's full of cynicism and negativity. And that repeated word, time, signals to readers how Scrooge measures everything by profit and loss. For him, for Scrooge, even Christmas has no emotional value unless it brings financial gain. And what this language does is captures a man drained of joy and happiness, someone who has replaced feeling, and indeed social responsibility and care for others, with cold, hard financial calculation. Dickens deliberately starts the novella this way, so that Scrooge's transformation later, over the course of the book, and certainly by Stave 5, feels complete and spiritually and morally uplifting. By contrasting this cold dismissal of happiness with Fezziwig's overflowing kind of abundance of laughter and joy and happiness, Dickens, I think, invites us as readers to see how joy and happiness can humanize and can ultimately redeem us, even someone who seems as irredeemable as Scrooge himself. And now we're going to shift to the middle of the text, particularly with looking at a really key moment in stave 3. And this is when the Ghost of Christmas Present visits the Cratchit family. And the tone completely changes. Their home is described as warm and bright. And Bob Cratchit's voice was, quote, tremulous when he told them Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Now, let's think about some of the language here. The adjectives warm and bright echo pretty directly Fezziwig's party. It's yet another image in a novella that's very interested in light and dark imagery and imagery relating to temperature, whether it's warmth, warm characters like Fezziwig and Fred, or cold characters, indeed, like Scrooge himself. We've got here another image of the Cratchits at Christmas, an image of light and togetherness. And even that word tremulous, meaning kind of shaky, shows Bob Cratchit's deep emotion. Bob's happiness is fragile, but it's sincerely held. And it's through this scene of the Cratchits at Christmas, the warm and bright Cratchit Christmas, it's through this scene that Dickens shows us that joy and happiness don't depend on wealth. The Cratchits, we know, we can tell, are poor. Mrs. Cratchit, brave in ribbons, for example, the twice-turned gown. And yet it is their love for one another, their gratitude for the meal that Mrs. Cratchit has put together, that make their home glow. The message from Dickens here is simple, but in fact all the more powerful for its simplicity. Happiness comes from human connection, not from material wealth. And so, now we turn to the end. And we're going to think about this in terms of redemption and a kind of spiritual and moral rebirth. By the end of the novella, Scrooge has fully absorbed this lesson, the lesson around joy and happiness in other human beings. One of the final lines about Scrooge reads thus, quote, his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. It is in many ways the perfect quotation bookend to Fezziwig's laughter that we experienced in the extract earlier in the story in Stave 2. Dickens personifies Scrooge's heart. It is now alive again, capable of feeling happiness and joy. And that phrase, quite enough, that was quite enough for him, suggests satisfaction, it suggests peace. Scrooge no longer needs external rewards or that kind of relentless pursuit of wealth and profit to be happy. It is a line, his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him, that captures really the entire moral message of the book. Joy is the proof of redemption. Dickens's vision of happiness, therefore, is ethical, it's moral, and it's communal. It's about togetherness. It's about our relationship with other people. When Scrooge reconnects with others, he rediscovers his capacity to laugh, to find joy, to find love, and indeed to give. So, across the book, across A Christmas Carol, Dickens takes us on a journey, and it's a journey from coldness to warmth, from isolation to community, from greed to generosity. Fezziwig's laughter, Fezziwig's joy and happiness, which Scrooge is reminded of, begins in many ways the transformation of Scrooge. The scene with the Cratchits and the familial closeness and love, well, that deepens the transformation in Scrooge, and Scrooge's final joy represents the completion of that transformation and spiritual journey. So happiness, Dickens suggests, It's certainly not a luxury. It's not even a mood. It's a moral choice. It is the light and warmth we create when we care for others. So, as always, thank you so much for listening to this episode. And as you use this episode to prepare for your essay for your homework, remember, we're not just identifying moments of joy in our writing, we're showing how Dickens uses them to express his faith, his belief in, and his moral message in the book around kindness, social responsibility, and humanity. So, I hope you found the episode really useful. Make sure you listen to it as part of your homework prep, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you so much.